will literally, you know, or the Australian equivalent.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's lovely to welcome you here to Cathedral Lodge. I'm David Monteith, the Dean here, and very pleased indeed to be able to introduce this evening's lecture. The Michael Ramsey Chair was originally created in 1991 as a memorial to Archbishop Michael Ramsey, the 100th Archbishop, in fact. We're just about to learn, hopefully in the autumn, about the 106th. And of course, Michael Ramsey had been the Regius Professor of Theology at Cambridge. And this chair is a key point of connection between the University of Kent and the Cathedral, and now particularly also specifically in association with the Institute of Cultural and Creative Industries. And Jonathan Arnold has been appointed as the third Michael Ramsey Professor, I think that's right. And of course he works in the field of culture, the arts and theology, and is Executive Director of the Social Justice Network here in Canterbury Diocese. And this lecture is the first in an annual series of Michael Ramsey lectures and events where we will welcome many speakers from prominent fields in theology, the arts, culture, and indeed social action. Jonathan, before coming to Kent, was previously Dean of Divinity and Fellow at Magdalen College, Oxford, and Chaplain of Worcester College in Oxford. Many of us know him because we listen to him singing with joy, and as well as singing here, he has sung with many of the great choral ensembles of our time, including the 16, the Gabrielle Consort, and so on. And he's a man with a prolific knack of using his pen or his computer. Publications include Sacred Music in Secular Society in 2014, Music and Faith in 2019, The Everyday God in 2024, and a new book is coming up in 2026, which will be probably entitled In the Key of the Kingdom, The Power of Music to Heal, Transform and Sanctify. And Jonathan has been particularly working on this interface between the arts, culture, faith, and action. And as an academic, a musician, a practitioner, a social campaigner, he brings all these different worlds in an interdisciplinary approach into his work and his thinking. And as well as all that he says, I'm in dangerous territory now, but unusually for some academics, he not only says, but he does. And so that's such a rich gift for us here that you bring to this professorship. And we look forward very much to many years of all of that ahead. And this evening we have a tantalizing question, which I have a view about. Have the arts become the religion of our age? Welcome, John.
Thank you. Thanks ever so much. How are we doing on the microphones? Can you hear me all right? So do you want the answer to the question? I want to make this as informal as possible. Thank you so much for that introduction. If you feel the need to top up your glass with wine, head to the back and Emma will furnish you with more wine. You might need it in about half an hour. Jennifer told me to make this lecture accessible, and if you feel it's not accessible, then just head to the back. Well, as David says, I've spent years talking about the interface between faith and the arts. And in talking about that, many times I've been talking about church decline, about the decline in institutional religion, and about how people have replaced that with different forms of spirituality. People who call themselves spiritual but not religious, and so on. But blow me, in the last 6 years if many, many more young people have started going to church. So it's a little bit difficult to argue that, but I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. So despite this recent and remarkable and encouraging growth for churches in England and Wales, the Bible and traditional Christian doctrine is still quite problematic for many people. And this is where alternative pathways to spiritual experience are being explored, including the arts. And in some cases, art has become, for some people, a kind of religion, or at least a surrogate religion. So in this lecture, we're going to explore arts as a surrogate religion. Who is it who believes in God these days? Artists and their response. What does a Christian artist have to say? Might the arts offer us a different way of knowing things? And what's the state of the current debate around all of this? And then to conclude, where do we go from here? Now, I want to make it clear that all of these points are really starting points for discussion and not answers in themselves. And I've also got a disclaimer. When you talk about the arts and you talk about religion, these are both enormous topics. So I'm going to confine myself, because I'm not an expert in world religions by any means, I'm going to confine myself to Western culture, mainly, and probably to the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that's where we will be. So let's crack on and think about the arts as a surrogate religion. And I'm going to start by with a little quiz question. And the category of this quiz is called Only Connect. And I want you to tell me what is the connection between the Council of Australasian Museum Directors and the rock musician Jimi Hendrix. Well, I'll put you out of your misery. If you go to their website, the Council of Australasian Museum Directors will tell you that the museum is the spiritual successor of the church. The museum is the spiritual successor of the church. And Jimi Hendrix once declared, "Music is my religion." Music is my religion. So both these statements relate to religion, institutional or otherwise, and its replacement with art. And so we're going to have a look at these in turn. Let's see what we've got. So first, the museum is the spiritual successor of the church. It seems to make sense, doesn't it? But it's problematic. The implications of the assertion are in fact multi-layered. The statement at once suggests that the arts exist in large part for our spiritual welfare. Not just the aesthetic or the social or the mental or the political, but spiritual. It implies that traditional sources of spiritual guidance, such as institutional churches and religions, are no longer the main provider of such help. But, ironically, it replaces them with another organised institution, in this case, the museum, as our spiritual guardian. So, the statement insists on the essential spiritual nature of our lives, whilst also tacitly diminishing religion, and in the process, paradoxically, promoting the religious language of spirituality. I told you it was complicated. Their statement epitomises what has now become called a post-secular redefinition of spirituality, not in terms of institutional religion, but rather, it seems, a kind of subjective religion, one religion amongst many. This is my religion. So we come to Jimi Hendrix. Music is my religion. It's equally apparently simple and equally problematic. It's a paradoxical claim that religion is at the same time dispensable and indispensable. It does not say music should replace religion, but that in his experience, it is religion. The concept of religion endures through a particular practice, and in this case, the practice is music. So secularity in this sense is, as Michel Dillon puts it, a set of historical conditions that destabilise the meaning of religion to the point where it becomes exchangeable. Exchangeable with what? That's addressed by the observation that there is, in secularity, a nominal equivalence of all religions. Every religion is equal to another, famously enshrined in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Cannot stop somebody practicing their religion, whatever it is, so long religion has the same value as any other. And by removing any details of how we define religion here, you can define it in however subjective way you want. Where religion is not a church, as an institution or a theological doctrine, but rather a function. These are the one's own form of subjectivity and actions, as Boyce Tillman puts it. So in this very broad definition, something fundamentally unconnected with theological and ecclesiological doctrine can be a religion. It can be music, it can be art. I mean, it could be fishing, it could be walking, it could be anything. So an art form which can play the function of providing transcendental experience, as people see it, we can call it religion. So the museum directors and Jimi Hendrix's assertions show us that the study of the relationship between the arts and religions is full of contradictions, paradox, and irony. But it also demonstrates that it's sometimes difficult to talk about the arts at all, and culture, in completely theological neutral terms. So, surrogacy, how does it come about? In the 19th century, the German poet Goethe wrote, "He who possesses art and science has religion. He who does not needs religion." If you have art and science, that's it. You've got the full package. If you don't have them, then you need religion. You need that faith thing that's going to make up, whatever it is that you're missing. So if Hendrix possessed art through music, then by Goethe's calculation, he doesn't need another religion, he's got one. We have Schleiermacher to blame for this. His term art religion, or Kunstreligion, paved the way for this concept of the arts as religion, emphasizing religion as a kind of subjective feeling, and prefiguring the 19th century blurring of sacred and secular genres with the virtual canonization of people like Beethoven and Mozart. Frank Boston has argued that the relationship between institutional Western Christianity and the arts really started deteriorating at the beginning of the 20th century, when Dadaism and Cubism and Futurism and conceptual art, fostered during the violence of two world wars, became highly critical of religion, or just ignored it and rejected it altogether. He writes, "The obvious connection between the artistic and the religious world was never completely broken, but it has become severely strained." He also argues that museums and art galleries have become the new sanctuaries of our world, which speak into our identity and citizenship, and even evoke the spiritual, where artists and conservators and connoisseurs and scholars guard the purity of our newest Holy of Holies. Likewise, writing in the Guardian newspaper, Francesca Gavial expressed how she thinks art has replaced religion. She wrote, "It seems to me that art has replaced religion. So if you fancy something sublime, emotive, or life-changing and God won't do, I recommend art. It works for me. I want something in life that inspires me on a grand, overwhelming scale. And visiting a major gallery is like stepping into a 21st century cathedral. Tate Modern's awesome cavernous spaces echo religious architecture. The former power station's towers resemble steeples pointing heavenwards, albeit through the titanium-tinted spectacles of high modernism. The classical pillars of the National Gallery aren't very different to St Paul's Cathedral. Even the simple, small, white cube galleries in East London are like Friends' meeting houses or Puritan chapels. So it's very interesting, and no doubt deliberately ironic, that Gavin relates this replacement of religion in terms that are resonant, clearly resonant, of religious heritage. She is saying that art is like religion, that they have similarities, but fears that this sacralisation of the arts might have gone too far. So she writes, arguably, things are getting out of control. The approaching Venice Biennale and Basel Art Fair could even be seen as glamorous reinventions of a trip to Mecca or jaunt to Jerusalem. Are art schools postmodern monasteries? Is Charles Saatchi the new post-pop pope? His praise guarantees sainthood to eager artists kneeling at his papal robes. If he could buy the Vatican and fill it with Martin Kippenberger and Peter Doig among the confessionals, I'm sure he would be tempted. Now, like many who propose the replacement of religion with the arts, there is an assumption that the definition of religion is subjective. In this case, it's a kind of recreational. It's something that she wants to give her a break from the everyday life. She wants to be forced to examine her life and just step out of her own personal preoccupations with art. But you can easily choose another one instead, she says. If you're looking at Anish Kapoor's abstract sculptural shapes, or Thomas Demant's super real paper environments, or a cut-up billboard piece on the street, and if that doesn't do it for you, there's always football. Choose what you like. In a more scholarly article, Richard Schusterman likewise equates the rise of art religion or art as religion in terms of art as a replacement for sacred text and ritual. So in the 20th century, Western culture, artworks have become the closest thing we have to sacred text. And art almost seems a form of religion with its prophetic breed of creative artists perennially purveying new gospels, and its priestly class of interpretive critics who explain them to the devotional public. He argues that art expresses very deep meanings and spiritual insights that religion and philosophy once most powerfully provided, but they now no longer convey in a convincing way to most of today's secular populations. By the way, he doesn't mention non-secular populations, so he seems to be preaching to his own sort of kind of choir here, just carrying the metaphor, but he does acknowledge that art cannot be separated from religion, and that religious heritage in our culture may have some influence. He says, art is simply another mode or expression of religion. Or to put it in a provocatively suggestive paraphrase, art is simply the continuation of religion by another means. If this hypothesis has merit, indeed, if there is simply some deeply insoluble link between art and religion, then we cannot simply look progressively past religion toward art. So Schusterman acknowledged that art is, in fact, indissolubly linked to culture. Culture is indissolubly linked to religion. However, the arts, as we have received them, are less complicated than religions, and therefore for many might be preferable. He says, art seems to be free of religion's disadvantages, thus promising a more fruitful and satisfying way for the expression of wisdom and spiritual meaning, replete with abundant sensory, emotional and intellectual pleasures. It provides the joys of mystery and myth without committing our faith to superstitions, and thus inducing the bitter aftertaste of shame that our scientific conscience is likely to experience upon attempts to swallow discredited otherworldly beliefs. Discredited otherworldly beliefs. Now, I can't let that phrase go. Discredited otherworldly beliefs. Because it doesn't speak for everyone. And so now, I want to have a look at those otherworldly beliefs and what is the state of Christianity today in the UK, West, globally. We're going to start with some facts, and as we all know, there are no facts quite so reliable as statistics. So here are some stats. Now we're going to measure what I'm going to measure is biblical literacy, one aspect of belief, let's say. So how post-religious or post-Christian are we in the West? For instance, do people know their Bibles anymore? The marked fall in biblical literacy in Britain through the generations was demonstrated by research released by the Bible Society just over a decade ago. Now, it found that 30% of secondary school children aged between 12 and 15 did not choose the Nativity when asked which stories they thought were in the Bible. They didn't recognise the Nativity. And amongst 15-year-olds, it's even higher. The number of 15-year-olds that indicated that they had not read, seen, or heard the Divinity, the Nativity, is around 34%, 1 in 3. Now, by contrast, over a third thought that the storylines featured in the Hunger Games, 54%, Harry Potter, might be from the Bible, or were from the Bible. More than 1 in 4, 30%, thought the storyline of Superman was from the Bible. And if you think about Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, it's 50%. 50% thought it was from the Bible. Parents themselves find it hard to distinguish the plot lines of well-known Bible stories from the latest Hollywood blockbusters. Asked to decide whether a series of plot lines appeared in the Bible, almost half of parents failed to recognise the plot of Noah's Ark as a Bible story, and around a third were unsure that they recognised the story of David and Goliath, or Adam and Eve, and a quarter didn't know the story of the Good Samaritan. However, fast forward to 2025, and some new stats have just come out about global figures. The Patmos World Bible Survey, again commissioned by the Bible Society, is based on more than 90,000 interviews conducted by Gallup with adults aged 15 and over in 85 countries in the world. And it found that the Bible has something meaningful to say about life today to nearly half of people in the Western world who responded. And more than a third believed that the Bible was relevant to them personally. About a third read the Bible at least once a month. Now, this is good, but of course it also reveals that in the West, 64% of people do not think that the Bible is relevant, and 68% of people do not read the Bible. If you go to the Sahel Central Band region of Africa, 100% of the respondents thought the Bible was relevant to daily life. 100%. Even Muslims who would call themselves inactive. And if in the majority Muslim countries, the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, it was 85%. And in sub-Saharan countries, 90%. So it's a mixed picture globally. So in the West, belief in propositional and doctrinal elements of religion are still not the norm for most people. But many do still declare faith in a higher power. Grace Davy has related this, well known, to the phenomenon of believing without belonging, in which people are connected to the institution and may attend for significant annual occasions, but do not give assent to all the creedal affirmations of the church. So Davy calls this Christian nominalism, where a militant atheism is relatively rare to being a nominal Christian. And another related idea to Davy's notion of vicarious religion, is what she calls it, in which people only remain distantly connected with the church, but they cherish it nevertheless. But, there has been an enormous shift in the UK. The findings come in the report, The Quiet Revival, a survey commissioned by the Bible Society again, 2025, and it reveals that church attendance in England and Wales has risen by 56% in the last 6 years, busting the myth of church decline. The Quiet Revival shows the most dramatic church growth is among young adults, particularly young men. In 2018, just 4% of 18 to 24-year-olds said they attended church at least monthly. And today, the Quiet Revival says this has risen to 16%, a fourfold increase, with young men increasing from 4% to 21%, young women from 3 to 12%. So overall, church-going Christians now make up 12% of the population in England and Wales, which is up from 8% in 2018, and in numerical terms, that's 2 million more people going to church now than 6 years ago. Quite extraordinary. The co-author of the Quiet Revival, Dr. Rhiannon McClear, says the report shows that what people believe about church decline is no longer true. These are striking findings that completely reverse the widely held assumption that the church in England and Wales is in eternal decline. While some traditional denominations continue to face challenges, we've seen significant broad-based growth among most expressions of church, particularly Roman Catholicism and Pentecostalism. Cardinal Vincent Nichols says that one of the reasons people might be going to church is because they're touched by beauty. He says it might be inside a church, it might be the beauty of nature. So often I've heard people say, as they step into the church, oh, there's something here. Can I find out a bit more about it? And the Archbishop of York, Stephen Cottrell, said this longing and meaning, this longing for meaning, purpose and connection is drawing them toward spiritual spaces where they can encounter God and find community. And he says it's not just a passing trend. It is part of a wider, quieter, spiritual awakening. There's a deep hunger for truth and belonging, and the church has a vital role to play in meeting that need. Well, the situation is mixed, and the situation is evolving. So, how might an artist of faith respond? So I'm going to make a little shift now away from art as religion, or art as replacement for religion, but think of art as part of religion, or art in religion. The Christian poet Michael Roberts has expressed some interesting thoughts on how words, art and music can steep into the secularized world. He noted that In 1951, David Jones had seen the early stages of what Seamus Heaney has since called the big lightening, the emptying out of our religious language. But even he may have been shocked by its pace. He saw the English language littered with dying signs and symbols, specifically the signs and symbols associated with our Judeo-Christian past. The resultant impoverishment hasn't just affected poets, but readers too. And this has been borne out now by common struggles of English teachers in schools and universities to provide the biblical and historical literary literacy necessary to make sense of Milton, John Donne, George Herbert, T.S. Eliot, and others. So what David Jones meant by this break, as he calls it, was an end to religious ideology and culture, and the dispensability of the arts in an age of technology. He said the priest and the artist are already in the catechism, separate catechisms, but in the catechism. But just as this emptying out of our religious and biblical vocabulary took hold of Western Europe in the late 20th century, so now there has been a revival in the search for the spiritual life. So Simmons-Roberts says, the Enlightenment project was meant to see off religion by now, but instead many sociologists argue that it is secularism that is in retreat. Christianity and Islam are growing very rapidly throughout the developing world, and a recent report will place the numbers of atheists worldwide as 3% and falling. In Western Europe, it's more complicated. A number of philosophers and sociologists, led by the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas, have coined the term post-secular to describe our current position. People in the West seem to be losing faith in organised religion, but there's a variety of views out there. So the Christian artist, says Simmons-Roberts, must show commitment to every aspect of the Christian story, the darkness as well as the light, if they are going to communicate to a new generation of churchgoers and to the secular world. And this applies to Christian endeavours in all art forms. So, he wrote, the Scottish composer James Macmillan, with whom I have been working as a librettist and collaborator for the last 10 years, has written about the current dominance of spiritual music on the classical scene, the great Sir James Macmillan. And one of the most striking aspects of Macmillan's music is that the whole story is there, the whole drama. Christ could not have risen if he hadn't been crucified. The battle is ultimately won, but continues all around us. Truly religious art, truly Christian art, whether poetry or music or whatever, must surely live and draw creative breath from that tension, that struggle, the completeness in the midst of the incompleteness. Spiritual music, like spiritual poetry, has come to mean a kind of one-dimensional, heightened or transcendent experience, without any sense of sacrifice or conflict. It's very accomplished and beautiful, but it's come to be a flight from reality, an escape from the darkness. So the term spiritual poetry is almost entirely stripped of its meaning. So, for Michael Simmons-Roberts, David Jones's image of the free-spirited and uncommitted artist, unfettered by religion or religious language, is and always has been an illusion. Simmons-Roberts says freedom is not absence. The absence of religion or the running away from reality doesn't create greater artistic freedom at all. For Roberts, there must be a commitment to the whole story of human suffering and salvation in all its bitter darkness as well as its comforting light. So how do we do that? If this emptying out has happened, how do we do it? Well, we need to find a new vocabulary, says Simmons-Roberts. And that's where Christian writer, speaker and missionary Ian Maudsley was brought up in a family rich in atheism and rationalism, where knowledge was considered as the acts of reasoned arguments concerning facts and deductive reasoning. But he also found that there was a contradiction in that the family, who were also extremely artistic, who lived music and the arts, ironically ignored the arts as a kind of intuitive knowledge. Although the music and arts were enjoyed, the opportunity for finding in them an intuitive path towards an implicit knowledge of something beyond the materialistic was sadly lost. It is this intuitive way of knowing that likewise touches many people in today's world. It's through experience, encounter and relationship that knowledge of a deeper reality of self and the other emerges through encounter and relationship. Perhaps through the arts, perhaps through nature, perhaps through people. And Maudsley found, like many others, that contemplation of art drew him towards something deeper and greater. He said, things were different for me. The arts touched my emotions and a deeper sense of self and enabled me to see a legitimate place for spirituality. And from an early age, my experience of and delight in the world enabled me to transcend my family's belief in atheism. So Ian's experience reminds me of those powerful words by Rowan Williams concerning listening. To listen seriously is to learn what it means to live with and before God. Maudsley's experience of listening to nature, contemplating it, sensing its intense music, at once gave him both a deep encounter with himself and the world around him, and also liberated his soul to perceive the divinity within and beyond it. He found a similar spiritual revelation through art. He said, my next memory and my first real spiritual experience was contemplating the Chagall stained glass window in Chichester Cathedral. It was full of mystery, beauty and awe. Chagall's window was overpowering in its experience of bright colours and symbolism which deeply moved me. So such experiences for Maudsley and others leads to the question, how do we know what we know? How do we know what we know? Since the Reformation and Enlightenment, the idea of knowledge in the Western world has been dominated by reason and argument, at the expense of knowing through experience, contemplation, intuition, and the other ways. Only recently, Maudsley argues, have we begun to realise that a more healthy answer to the question is a balance of knowing through both reason and experience. The role of rational language, especially word-centred emphasis on post-Reformation modernity, has brought with it a tendency to objectify God through language, leading, in some cases, to fundamentalism. But as Peter Rollins reminds us, God's revelation is always, always surrounded in mystery. The Dean of Southwark, Mark Oakley, suggested whatever we call God is known through relationship and experience and is not simply an object of knowledge. The relationship with God, not God as object pinned down to dissect and endlessly talk about, but as the subject to whom we relate most deeply and peacefully, is the most important relationship of all. God is not the object of our knowledge. God is the cause of wonder. Like any relationship, it can be turbulent. He says, I see now that the opposite of faith is not doubt, but certainty. Certainty. Because faith must grow and change. That is why poetry, he says, keeps my priesthood alive. For Oakley, it is the resonance of poetry within the beautiful space of ritual that keeps his faith alive, rather than the seduction of quick clarity and soundbite theology. Another writer who advocates different ways of knowing is Meredith Maguire. She speaks for an art form that encounters the transcendent not through the word and the mind, but in immersive, embodied experience. She writes, "Many of us were brought up thinking that the spiritual realm is completely set apart from the mundane material realm, perhaps even opposed to it. Western societies in recent centuries have tended to view spirituality and materiality as dichotomous, in tiny binary opposition. Accordingly, those individuals who wanted to enhance their spirituality would have to overcome the burden of materiality, deny their material urges and concerns, and transcend the limitations of the material body." In contrast to this tendency, Maguire argues that spirituality that fully involves people's material bodies. Maguire's argument arises from an examination of lived religion, or lived religion is constituted by practices by which people remember and share and enact and adapt and create and combine the stories out of which they live. For instance, most of us also experience certain body practices, postures, movements, ways of focusing our attention as more conducive to our spiritual experiences than others. Even memory requires all, including our social senses. It's not just a memory game, it's not just a mind game. Memory requires a lot more than that. Maguire has alluded to, in theory, Christian religion should be particularly aware of human embodiment because the central idea is Christ's incarnation of becoming human, the body, Christ's humanity. But due to several different historical developments, many Christian groups today are uncomfortable with any emphasis on human embodiment. So she says our tidy dichotomy between the sacred and the profane and its corollary between the spiritual and the material is a social construction. It's a false dichotomy, historically rooted in the Reformation. A ritual expression of abstinence and sorrow and bodily mortification and thoughts of death, balanced by periods of ritual practices of consumption and joy and bodily pleasure and affirmation of life. People participated with their bodies, their very bodies, in the ritual expression of these emotion-laden religious seasons. In the medieval world, people experienced a much more varied form of bodily religion. So, not only in the past was the body closely tied to people's material concerns such as healing and fertility and nourishment, but also grounded in the material reality of the human body and the spiritual life. So, different ways of knowing. The knowing involved in making a cake is contained not simply in my head, but in my hands, and my wrists, and my eyes, and my nose. The phrase bodily knowledge is not a metaphor, it's an acknowledgement of the fact that I know things literally with my body, that I, as my hands, know when the bread dough is sufficiently kneaded. I've recently started to play the classical guitar again, and since it's been 30 years since I played the classical guitar, the knowledge that my fingers used to have, not quite there anymore. So, embodied practices like singing tap emotions and memories. Collective embodied practices such as singing or dancing together can produce an experiential sense of community and connectedness. Without the full involvement of the material body, religion is likely to be relegated to the realm of cognitions, beliefs and opinions and ideas, embodied practices including mundane and seemingly unexceptional activities, like preparing a meal, link our materiality as humans and our spirituality. And it's not only musicians who found the human body to be crucial to the story of art, the human condition in time and space. The artist Anthony Gormley stated that sculpture's central purpose in confronting the materiality of the body with another materiality is to engage with the imagination, to make links with all that lies beyond the palpable and the observable, deep in space, time, in the unconscious mind. According to Thaddeus Roback, Gormley's work has developed in the potential opened by sculpture since the 1960s through a critical engagement with both his own body, Gormley's body, and those of others, in a way that confronts fundamental questions of where human beings stand in relation to nature and the cosmos. Well, this is all very well, you might say, but where's the traditional Christian standpoint? Where's the art theology that talks about doctrine and scripture and revelation? Is there any? Well, of course there is. And there is a more conservative approach. And this comes from our old friend, one of the greatest authorities on art and theology at the moment, Jeremy Bentley, currently at Duke in America, sometimes comes over to Cambridge. And in his book, Redeeming Transcendence in the Arts, bearing witness to the triune God, Begbie defends the role of traditional Trinitarian theology, arguing that talk concerning the role of transcendence through the arts has become woolly and vague and has lost its true meaning of the Christian gospel, even if the talk has had the best of motives. He said, in a proper eagerness to make common cause with those of little or no explicit faith, we have too frequently lost a sense of the disturbing particularities and disruptive power of the vistas presented in the Old and New Testament. Begbie argues that we have, as it were, been putting the cart before the horse. The prevailing subjectivity regarding religion within secularity, as exemplified in the Council of Museum Directors that we saw earlier with Jimi Hendrix, positions the arts as the starting point for the divine encounter. When Begbie argues our interpretation of artistic truth, goodness and beauty, the traditional attributes of transcendence, truth, goodness and beauty, should come after the explicit knowledge of creeds, Bible, Christian history and doctrine. He says, I question the wisdom of orientating a discussion of divine transcendence in the arts around philosophical traditions of this sort a priori, lest the singular perspectives opened up by the scriptures and carried forward in the church's traditions are muffled and skewed and thus not allowed to exercise their distinctive power. So whilst Schopenhauer and Wagner emphasized art's sublime and graspable nature beyond conceptual thought, with meaning that is beyond representation, and according to Vladimir Yankelevich, the arts take us to something ineffable, something other, something beyond words. Begbie contends that if the other is no more than something unknowable, it is no more than an empty void. His great rival, they were at St Andrews together, and they're still sparring today, David Brown. It's a great story, this rivalry. Now he's critical, of course he is, he's critical of what he sees as Begbie's Trinitarian doctrinal constraints, access to the divine through the arts. But Brown need not be transcendent at all. Brown points to the theological implications of Schleiermacher's feeling of absolute dependence, or Rudolf Otto's awe before the disturbing mystery. So Begbie rejects these partial encounters, where only some aspects of the divine are revealed. For Brown, he thinks that Begbie's constraining our potential encounter with the divine through the God-given gifts of the arts. By his insistence upon this word-centered doctrinal scrutiny, it must pass muster before it can be legitimized as proper Trinitarian Christianity. Now, we're not going to solve that debate today. It's going to go on and on. It's a bit binary and it's a bit polarized too. But I'm going to wrap up. Where are we going? Have the arts become the religion of our age? Well, yes. I mean, it looks like for many in the West it would seem so. But there are 2 million more people attending our Christian churches, most of them young, searching for meaning and values which they've not found elsewhere. But where art and religion are most powerful together is where the arts are authentically reflecting the whole story of our Christian existence, what it truly means to be human. And if it relates to a religious narrative, to be able to live and draw creative breath from, as Simmons Roberts said earlier, the tension, the struggle, the completeness in the midst of incompleteness is the story of our redemption. That's where we are. So for the arts to be this, we might need to find new ways of engagement with contemporary culture. As the arts have always done in the past, they've adapted, been evolved. This might mean creative vocabularies, whether they be verbal or visual or sonic or culinary or bodily or oral or sensory, to value the whole range of human attributes and experiences. Because the arts and faith are really closely aligned, actually. The experience of one can evoke the other. The arts can also challenge. They can disturb. They can enrich. They can challenge. They can accompany. They can embrace our faith. And they're lived out together, art and religion, in time and space, in our minds, in our bodies, and our spirits. And they give us insights into the divine through embodied process that can't be experienced by the brain alone. Religious practice, ritual, performance, and engagement are all part of that story. The arts are part of a bigger picture of divine gift and encounter through nature. It's a gift that God continues to give, and one that's available to everyone and everywhere. Thanks so much for listening.
Director of the Institute of Cultural and Creative Industries.
He's my boss.
Somebody described me as Jonathan's line manager, there's no chance. We are proud hosts of Jonathan in the Institute of Cultural and Creative Industries at the University of Kent. And I'm just here to do the Q&A. I'd like to take a liberty first and refer to something that was said at the very start. When Dean David said he had a view on this subject. So I'm going to come into the audience, start with my co-host. What was your view on this, Dean David? Is it on? Oh, that was
Well, Jonathan, thank you very much for the tour of the landscape, which I can see that we're going to kind of work on in the coming years. I suppose one of the things I'm interested in is is less the either-ors, and there's lots of either-ors in this story, but more in what's going on in this messy middle bit. And particularly in that messy little bit, in the relationship between the historic, the traditional, the given, the history, all of that, and the interpretation now. And I suppose within all of that as well, I mean, although I'm very familiar with the criticisms that many people are so unaware of the traditions that, you know, looking at a modern table with a group of people sat at it don't make any connection with any other story about another table with a group of people sat there. I know that's the case, but actually there's a much more complex use of that iconography now in popular culture, in the way the internet works. And I just wonder if you could comment a bit on that complex mix. It seems to me that much of the creativity is to be found rather than at the noisy dichotomies at either end of it.
Yeah, thank you very much. One of the problems of this subject is a kind of polarised discussion because much of it is taking place in universities, and universities that don't necessarily specialise in interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary gathering. And so you either get an artist talking or you get a theologian talking. And of course they speak from their own perspectives. So you do get that problem. I think we are very much in the messy side of things where we are now. And I think that's a positive thing. I think we've come to a place of growth, actually. I'm not sure that David Jones's great emptying out, really happened. I know we were afraid of it, and yeah, sure, I've taught in universities where people turn up and don't know the Bible, so how on earth are they going to study English, or anything else for that matter? So there is a bit of a problem, but there's also such an area of growth. And what I'm wrestling with at the moment is that we have had quite a long period of time where the binary of the new atheism and the fundamentalism has kind of died down now. The great kind of Dawkins debates. They're all passing. We've come into this more post-secular age where everything's on the table. And it's interesting that, for quite a few people, abstract art or something which isn't figurative or doesn't necessarily relate to anything necessarily biblical or has any references at all, can be just as revelation as any other, and that's a really, really good thing. And people who call themselves spiritual but not religious are also finding these different pathways in the middle. We're willing to explore all areas. But then 2 million more 18 to 24-year-olds go to church. And so, what's going on? And I don't think there's anything that we could have predicted, this quiet revival. But the search for meaning has always been the key issue through the arts and religion. It's that search for meaning. What's it all about? Who am I? What am I here for? What do I believe? What are my values? How am I going to live? That's why artists make art, because they're not doing it. I don't know. John Rotter made art for different reasons, to sell records and to invent Christmas, but there's a lot of art out there which has not fuzzy, but it has an indeterminate outcome that does rely on offering and receiving, and both of those stages can come from an offering of explicit faith, like Sir James Macmillan when he writes a symphony, is probably full of plain song and Christian references, and he explicitly says this is a Christian piece of music, it's abstract, there's no words in it, but it's Christian, it comes from a Christian heritage, it comes from a Christian believer. There are other people who offer a much more numinous way in, which can be equally attractive and equally productive, because it's about relationship. It's about relationship between the person who creates and the person who receives. So it's a slightly long and complicated answer, but it's quite a complicated question, I think, about where we are now. But I feel really excited about where we are now.
Right, we are open to the floor. Let's go. Oh, hang on, I'll bring you the microphone.
Some years ago, the fashionable way of thinking about our culture was described as postmodernist, pick and mix culture. Is that right now?
Sort of supermarket sweep. I never really understood postmodernism. I think it was a dead duck when it arrived, and I think it's even deader now. So yeah, this pick and mix thing, I think people have had enough of that. I don't think that's what post-secularism is. I think post-secularism, if I've understood it at all, a big book on that is really sort of Charles Taylor, but it's very confusing and illogical in some ways. Habermas would say, it's about tolerance, it's about living together, it's about multiculturalism, it's about diversity, but also unity in society. And I think if that can be a way where we move together, where we can disagree without resorting to violence, that's the way forward. And I think that's where the best art can happen. It can challenge, and should challenge, where violence is happening, where political situations are created that should be held accountable. That is a serious part of what needs to be done, because it's about justice. And we must have that. So I think where we are now is a place where, in some sectors of society at least, there is a chance for more productive dialogue. Sadly, in some parts of the West, and certainly in other parts of the world, the polarisation, the fundamentalism, and the lack of listening, the lack of empathy between people and nations is as bad as ever, or worse than ever. So that's where art has to speak into the mess. That's why I say it has to talk about the whole human story, and it's in the dirt as much as anywhere else. And that's what the incarnation is about. About Jesus being with us in the mess, in the muck, in the suffering, in the pain.
Second hand is back.
I was wondering if you could clarify something. So you said people don't know the Bible, so how are they going to learn English? Could you just clarify that a little bit?
Yeah, so for instance, Steve David was saying there's some people sitting around the table, and how does that relate to? So if in a novel or something, you've got some people sitting around the table, which could be an allusion to the Last Supper with Jesus and his disciples, for instance. But if you don't know that story, then you might not be able to interpret all the other biblical allusions that occur in the poetry of John Milton and John Donne and T.S. Eliot, because it's absolutely chock full of biblical references. So it's as simple as that. And of course, it's not just the Bible, but there's lots and lots of other references in there. If you the way the opposite of April is the fairest month, isn't it? In Chaucer. So it's all those literary. What was it? Yeah. So it's all those allusions that I was referring to. Yeah.
No idea now, excuse me.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I was struck by a comment that you made in the first half of the lecture, when you said the classical pillars of the National Gallery are not so different as St Paul's, which is really interesting, illuminating comment, and I put my question, if it is probably more of a comment really, about the context of national identity, the making of national identity, and the place of, if you like, national Protestantism within a religious universe. You know, I mean, both of them, it's true, happen to be neoclassical buildings, and maybe a significance there. But we're talking about the 1830s, aren't we, for the National Gallery? There's quite a competition and lack of agreement about what it should be, but we've got what we've got. St Paul's, of course, earlier, 1670s, a kind of Anglican version of a Roman basilica, you might say. Now, having said that, it's perhaps not so clear as a sort of Roman Catholic versus Protestant comparison that we should be making, but one feels, as we're sitting here in the Cathedral precinct, in the context of Anglicanism, how we would see that sort of parallel between a national church, which became an imperial church, Anglicanism, and the state taking over some responsibility for the arts and the framework of the national identity.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, isn't it? And I'm not sure that how does the state, it's a state church, and through which great artistic things have happened. And you could argue that a great artistic thing happens in the cathedral every day through choral evensong. Notice Hannah is here. Hannah's the great expert on choral evensong in the Netherlands, where it's a fresh expression, and people are turning up to choral evensong in Reformed and Lutheran churches in the Netherlands to hear English-style cathedral choirs of adults and children. And they're packed, they're absolutely packed with people who are listening to the words in English, the Revd, the emphasis, the anthem, and the readings are in Dutch. So, explain that one, So that's something that's national, if you like. It came out of the Reformation through the monastic reforms and the cathedrals that emerged with their endowments or otherwise from Henry. And what we've ended up with, which is a reformed Braddock and a monarchy as our head. How does that affect our relationship to religion and the arts? Well, it's interesting, perhaps, that the biggest rise in the numbers of people going to church are in Catholicism and Pentecostalism. Is that because there's more directional theology in those churches? It's more clearly defined, this is true, that's true. Whereas, we're Anglicans, so we're the same. So anything could be true. So yes, I think it's how Anglicanism in the past as a state church has had a great deal to contribute to the conversation between religion and the arts, because it can span that middle ground. It's not quite so black and white. There are some areas that can be explored in the middle of that. But I'm not sure I can really resolve that one. It's a very good question. Thank you. We're over here. Okay.
Thank you. Ben, it's not actually a question, but you mentioned, or you quoted at the beginning, near the beginning, somebody talking about shame.
Shame, yes.
Shame. And I wanted to just read to you something from a man called Lionel Trilling, who wrote a book in 1972, a great book actually, called Sincerity and Authenticity. And he talks about the use of art and thought of high culture for the purposes of moral accreditation, which in our times, this was 1972, announces itself in the facile acceptance of the shame that art imputes, and in the registration of oneself in the company of those who, because they see themselves as damned, are saved. Now, this is slightly cute sort of phrasing, but I think this question of shame and, the shame of being a human and, does art confront us with that or not? And then what do we do with it? I think that's quite important because, all of us in this room and the people who do not engage with the arts at all, who are not in this room, who are drinking high-strength lager on the streets of Ramsgate, where I live, and Canterbury, we all experience shame. And in some sense, I think Trilling, even in his very high-handed way, hit on a really good point, which is that shame should not be confronted cheaply just because you know what's on at the National Theatre or what's on in the National Gallery. If you see where I'm going, it's sort of, I think it touches on something deeply human when you talk about shame. And what role does art play in that? Maybe this connects with your point about the whole human experience, not just sort of, the nice bits. But I mean, it just seems incredibly relevant, even though it was written more than 50 years ago. So it's not a comment, it's not a question, but I don't know if you want to speak about that, since you quoted the word shame.
Yeah. The quotation I gave was talking about the shame induced by these, by believing these discredited supernatural beliefs. That, you're ashamed because you're told that you're damned and you've got to repent and all of that. So I think that's what he was getting at. Great art can address that. I don't know if you know Albert Herring, the opera Albert Herring, which is had a death of a boy. And Albert Herring in Suffolk, Britain, gets the blame for it and has to endure public shaming in that opera. And it really explores the human capacity for cruelty and blame, as well as the emotion and the suffering of the damned. And I think that is part of our human experience, and I think great art should be addressing that as much as any other aspect of the human experience. I guess, I don't know if we're talking about religion, that shame takes on a bigger significance, because we're talking about salvation. And if we're talking about salvation, what does that look like? And is it in the life hereafter, or is it now? Where is redemption, and how does it work? We also have so many thousands and thousands of pieces of music and art about Jesus taking on our shame on the cross, and the theological debates around exactly what that is. Is it Jürgen Milton's crucified God? Is it penal substitution? So there are so many different ways that art could speak into theology about, well, what is your theology? What is your theology? Put it very simply, there's an old adage that if you want to know what somebody's theology is, ask them what their favourite hymn is, and you will find out. Because that's what they think. So, yeah, thank you for that comment.
One more?
One more. Rick.
Yeah, hang on.
Oh, Joe. Okay.
I won't. They'll come.
I think Rick. I think Rick.
The quick answers will be good.
They're quick answers.
Your point about the Netherlands and the pond, it seems to me that takes us back to a much earlier period, when, for example, people, largely illiterate population, nevertheless learnt of the Christian story through looking, being told to them with the help of statues. The musical part, which is largely a result of the Council of Trent, resisting iconoclasm of music, and insisting that music should be allowed to develop. At the time then, they were very serious about pressures. All of these things, it seems to me, have gone on for centuries. And I have mild criticism of your presentation. It seems to me one needs to look back
Yes.
over a much longer period.
Oh, yes.
I'm not saying, I appreciate it. Is it possible for you
Yes.
to do that in this lecture? But
That's
it
right.
seems to me, if we don't look at the whole history,
Yeah.
and indeed not just Christianity,
Yeah.
but when we talk about the Bible, people in the Roman Empire, gentlemen, children of the Roman Empire, were educated in the great Roman classics, precisely to hold the culture of that empire together. The Greeks knew their home. It seems to me we need to look back
Yeah.
to get these things properly into perspective, and
Yeah.
possibly odd drops in them.
No, you're definitely right, and I did put in a section about medievalism and about how people learned their faith through image and windows and mystery plays and statues and music and all sorts of different ways. So yes, in the largely illiterate as a language of religion was Latin anyway, which was only learned by the intelligentsia. So yes, absolutely. The arts were pre-Reformation were much more part of the story through the liturgical year. For everybody, they were embodied. They were embodied in everybody's daily lives, and the oral tradition and the visual tradition is how that was kept alive. If you buy my book, Music and Faith, the whole first section is about medieval church. Finally.
Thanks so very much for fitting me in. At the beginning of the lecture, you used the phrases that art is a religion, but art's a surrogate religion, and that art's a successor religion. And I wasn't sure, in the light of the rest of the lecture, how you saw the relationship between those three ideas and whether you want to run them together or allow that they might be separated. Thinking particularly about the last of them, would you allow for the possibility that art would be a successor to religion for many people in the sense of playing important roles that religion might have played in the past, without doing so in the shadow of religion? I mean, I'm thinking particularly what you said about ways of knowing, a very interesting section of the lecture, and the idea that art can provide kinds of insight into human experience, enrich our sensory experience, enrich our understanding of one another, and give us moral insights and enrich our moral awareness. Would you allow for the possibility that art could play that important kind of role without in any sense being a surrogate religion?
Yeah, for many people it does. The arts provide a morality, a moral guide. They provide a sense of direction to people's lives. They provide them with nourishment emotionally and psychologically, and even, you might want to say, spiritually. Lots of people use that word. And the people I quoted consider that art is their version of religion, and for other people it might be football. So, how far does that get you? Well, first of all, it means that you have to really be reductive in your definition of what a religion is, because religion is a set of beliefs and practices that follows a particular, usually follows a particular institutional guide, whereas art isn't that. But the writers that I was presenting have said that the successors to religion, what they do is that they create their own hierarchy of priesthood with these curators and conservators and these scholars, and they provide sacralized, canonized artists who become virtually saints in themselves. And that's also true in other forms of life. And people can call that transcendent. But some people would say that that's all very well, but there's something that religion can offer that the arts ultimately cannot do. And of course, that depends on the particular perspective. You might find that the arts provide everything you need. But as I say, the search for meaning, the search for identity, maybe even relationship with something higher than the human, or the material, or the consumeristic, is certainly what a lot of people are searching for. And I think, really for me, the arts work best alongside religion, can do. I'm not saying all art has to be religious, not by any means. It doesn't have to be religious at all. But in this post-secular society, there's room for all different kinds. Certainly, there's room for people who believe exactly as you were saying. For some it's a surrogate, for some it's a replacement, for some it's a successor. And for others, it's a bit more messy than that.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you all for coming. I personally take it as another very encouraging sign that we had to be moved to a larger room to accommodate Jonathan's audience. So it's a very, very, very strong showing of people with serious interest in a serious topic. And very interesting. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks,
Please join me in thanking Jonathan.